When you hear the Fillmore, what do you think of? Music, food, culture? Well, I've lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, and I know that it's named after the 13th US president, Millard. I also know that it's been a live music destination for more than a century, that it's been the heart of black culture here in San Francisco for quite some time. But things are changing. There's Michelin-starred restaurants and boutiques. The Church of St. John Coltrane closed down. But I know that every night of the week I can catch live jazz at the Sheba Lounge. And that makes me feel connected to a rich part of the Fillmore's history. Let's go back in time and look at the heyday of jazz in the Fillmore with Lubna Takruri.
These streets in the Fillmore District tell tales of reinvention. The Fillmore rose in the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake as a Western addition to the devastated downtown. Jewish merchants mixed with Asian immigrants in a lively new city center. On these streets, a Japanese population was forcibly removed, and these streets birthed an African-American jazz scene that was called the Harlem of the West.
Many newcomers to this tech-heavy city may not know about the thriving music and culture heyday of the neighborhood. But for the San Franciscans who were here back then, the memories of nightlife and community are still as vivid as ever.
I wanna tell about a fella who's a trumpet whiz. Now he's been called a crazy rebel, but most call him Diz. And he is swinging and the jazz kicking.
The Fillmore was very bustling. It was in the early 40s, and it was bustling. I can remember about 1945, there were many black-owned nightclubs. Well, with black folks, if you have a restaurant, you gotta have some blues and jazz.
My father, his career was like in the 40s and the 50s. He played at all the major venues up along the Manor Plaza, the Wesley Johnson's Playhouse, the Big Glass, the Club Alabama, all these places. He used to tell me about where they were playing at and stuff. And my mother worked at the Scully Owl Drugstore right there on Gary and Fillmore. She was the first black woman to work there for the Scully Drug. And we were right there on the corner, across from the Fillmore Auditorium or the Primalal Ballroom. That was ground zero for me. I knew all about this. That's all I knew. It was very vibrant. The people would dress up to come out. They would be like dressed to the nine. The women would be wearing these wonderful hats and gloves and stuff.
Memories of this time have been beautifully preserved in the book Harlem of the West. They describe a unique moment in history when top musicians would mingle with neighborhood locals. While the most famous black musicians could play in the downtown clubs, they weren't allowed to sleep at hotels there. So they'd come back to the Fillmore and play into the wee morning hours. Ironically, segregation had played a role in creating a black community that was welcoming to all parts of society.
Black people played on a circuit called the Chitlin Circuit. And that Chitlin Circuit went all the way from New York City to Chicago, all around the nation. And the Fillmore Jazz District was part of that Chitlin Circuit. In those days, the performances were between 9 and 1, but there were after-hour joints. One of those joints in the Fillmore was called Bop City.
And Bop City was where they had many great people such as Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, all of the big major people that performed at some of these other clubs, which were maybe more downtown or in other areas. They would come to Bop City, which was like an after-hours club, and they would hang out there and have something to eat and relax, and they would jam and play.
This festive moment in the city's history was partly caused by the tragedy that preceded it. Before it was the Fillmore Jazz District, it was a thriving Japantown.
My Japanese friends they had to go, and I was wondering, where did they go?
During World War II, Japanese populations across the West Coast were forced out of their homes into internment camps, meaning the Fillmore, with more than 200 Japanese-owned businesses, rapidly changed in character. The neighborhood's African-American population increased from just over 2,000 to nearly 15,000 people between 1940 and 1950, and Harlem of the West flourished.
At its height, it was wall-to-wall people from Hayes Street all the way up to California, even farther. Some people would come, and they would come Friday afternoon, and they wouldn't go home till Sunday. They would just party 24 hours.
Just from one place
Yeah,
to the
exactly.
other.
Lewis Watts is one of the co-authors of the definitive history of the neighborhood, the book Harlem of the West. He spent decades walking these streets, collecting the history and photos that may have otherwise been lost to time.
This is the block where a lot of things happened. Red Shine Parlor was at 1549, right over there. Reggie's New Chicago Barbershop was right here behind us. I went into Red Shine Parlor, and Red Powell, who was the proprietor, I said, wow, this is great. He had pictures of everybody that had gone through the Fillmore, like entertainers, local people.
In the 40s.
Yes, in the 40s and 50s. But when I saw him, it was in the 90s. And when I went back, the space where he was empty and the walls were empty. And I remember someone out in the street, I said, what happened to these photographs? And he says, I think someone rescued him, but nobody knew. So I was across the street at the New Chicago Barbershop, and Reggie Pettis said, oh, they're in my back room. And I almost fell over.
The vibrant jazz and culture scene in these photos existed in a short window of history. It was formed in the aftermath of one tragedy, the displacement of the Japanese, and it was lost to another tragedy of removal and displacement caused by urban redevelopment. The neighborhood's rapid population increase was partly responsible for the city to designate some areas as what they called urban blight.
Things were very much in disrepair. I remember growing up in there in the 50s, the buildings were dilapidated. And they were roach infested, rat infested, mice infested, and no paint on them. And this is the environment I remember growing up in. And that's when the redevelopment came in there and just changed the entire scene up, because it took the spine out of it.
As the neighborhood grew older, it needed repairs. And that's a simple way of describing redevelopment. But the repairs were bittersweet. It modernized the Fillmore physically, but so many of the residents had to move out.
The Fillmore then got swept into a national movement of urban redevelopment, which was considered by some as an effort of black removal.
We were displaced. We had a house up on Scott and Ellis Street, and they moved us out of that. We had a business on O'Farrell and Fillmore. We had a used furniture junk store, 2 levels, and it was, it was a vibrant business, and they tore that building down. So they just displaced us, and we had to move. They gave you a paper and saying this such and such dwelling is going to be demolished on a such and such a date. And hopefully we can get you back in here, which to a lot of families and people, they never came back. And our businesses never came back. We had restaurants, we had hotels, we had record shops, we had clothing stores, we had beauty salons and everything. All of it wiped out. And it never came back.
don't want to see us go back. I want to see jazz spread, and that's what it has done.
Our scene coming back, I don't see that. I just don't see the numbers, you know. But I've been very fortunate that the families that are still here. I have found some younger musicians to work with that are working with me now. You know, they look up to me, and like I'm trying to be a mentor to them, like how I was mentored. So I'm just trying to pass along what I got. So I'm trying to give it back to them.
The legacy of the Fillmore remains alive in the music, in people's memories, in a rescued history. It's also preserved in plain sight, in places you might not suspect.
This is the building where Jimbo's Bop City was located, around the corner on Post, right in what is Japantown now. This was probably an internationally known after-hours place that was started originally by Jimbo Edwards, who had a Waffle House, and then musicians in town would come and say, can we jam here? A lot of these buildings were torn down, and in the middle of that process, neighborhood activists sort of stopped the redevelopment agency from doing it, and instead of just tearing down buildings, they were able to sue them and get them to move some of them.
That's right. This Victorian that used to be Bop City was put on a trailer and moved here around the corner. It received landmark status from the city in 2014 for its history, both as Bop City and then as Marcus Books, the nation's oldest African-American bookshop, which also closed in 2014. But above all else, the legacy lives on in the hearts of those who were fortunate to have been there.
I remember we had a mural down the street, and there was an older gentleman there looking at it, and I said, so what do you think about this? He says, I come see it every day because it reminds me of the best time of my life.
The Fillmore's glory days for jazz may be just a memory, but Black art and culture are still here, in pockets. One has to wonder, what is San Francisco doing to support contemporary artists? Is it stuck in a bygone era, or is it bringing life to something new? I'm here at the African American Art and Culture Complex. For 40 years, it's supported the Black community and helped artists and young people create and thrive. In part 2 of this episode on the Fillmore, Sade McDougall talks to creatives and city officials about what we need to do to keep artists of color in San Francisco.
Out of the rubble of the city's misguided urban renewal of the 1960s and 70s, the Fillmore neighborhood is growing into its new identity. History is still celebrated, but with a modern touch.
I did a piece that focused on Wesley Johnson's Club Flamingo, and then there was a piece that was a bit more edgy that focused on the redevelopment agency and sort of the destruction of this community. For the anti-eviction mapping project, I wanted to focus on the clubs, but I also wanted to focus on just the real people of the Fillmore, because that's what really made it the Harlem of the West.
Mark Harris is a visual artist creating social commentary work. His pieces reflect some parts of his reality in San Francisco as an artist of color. In a city known for its creative and innovative spirit, things are changing.
The 3.9 Collective is a collective of African-American artists who live and work in San Francisco. 3.9 is referencing a census statistic that basically says the African-American population will be at 3.9%, I believe, by the next census. If the community of creatives is diminished to the point where, you know, it's like an endangered species, that you have to move elsewhere. And I think that's a real loss for the city, as well as the technology community, because they're here because of the reputation of the city.
Jacory Baptiste is one of those artists carrying forward the reputation of the city and the legacy of the Fillmore. He's a singer-songwriter and composer and has been playing music since he was 8 years old while growing up in the neighborhood and hearing about the jazz days.
Growing up in this neighborhood has been amazing. I love it. The community, just the music presence that I grew up around, the influences through the church. I mean, I had a great upbringing here in the city, and I'm grateful.
Jacory was looking for a piano player and met Sam Peoples Jr. Now, Sam is passing along his own decades of experience in the Fillmore.
Once he seen that I had an interest in the history of Fillmore, he just pulled out all this wealth of information, and for me, that was just valuable. I felt amazed, just a sense of pride too, to first of all know that here it is. I'm curious about the history in the Fillmore, and I've been doing music with this gentleman, and now he's given me this wealth of information. It's just, I feel very lucky. Connecting the age gap would be probably one of the things I like to do. And I just think it's just about showing how actually a lot of the instrumentation of the music of the 30s and 40s actually fits well with today's music and is used by today's producers.
At the African American Art and Culture Complex, visitors can see exhibits from Black artists, attend performances, or take classes. Its directors say that offering resources for artists beyond material support is also crucial to helping them succeed.
We also are a space for adult services with health and wellness, with people who have specific needs. So there are so many different people who rely on this space for whatever they're up to creatively, and on a social justice and social services platform.
The center is a beacon of support and activity for arts in this historic neighborhood, but it's become increasingly difficult for artists of color to stay in this city.
I think in the city overall, we're seeing a lot of these communities that were once known as the epicenter of the arts, whether it's the Mission or the Fillmore District, who have suffered from the high cost of living and gentrification and shifts in population, and how that's affected the ability to maintain arts in those communities, especially that are authentically created by the communities that they're known for. So whether it's the African American community in the Fillmore or the Latino or Latinx community in the Mission, we see that kind of challenge of groups trying to maintain that flavor and that sense of vitality for that specific community, and struggling to do so in the light of the high cost of living and doing business.
According to the U.S. Census taken every 10 years, the African American population in San Francisco peaked at 13% in 1970. From 1970 to 2010, that number dropped by half and has been on the decline ever since.
So when you hear that number, the experience is how much of yourself do you get to see? And what is the range of yourself that you get to see? If 37% of the homeless population or the houseless population is African American, then what do you think our view is? You know, like, how much of us do we see shining, surviving, thriving, have a good quality of life? And so that has an emotional impact. That has a psychological impact.
And artists in the Bay Area have to deal with the financial impact of the soaring cost of living here.
Right now, the retail and just basic living space in San Francisco is extremely expensive.
As we know, there's a lack of parity in the economy, particularly when you're looking at communities of color. And it's even magnified more so in the arts, because arts itself is a sector that's underfunded. So when you are also a person of color or from a differing or marginalized community and an artist, that is even doubly challenging for you to be able to be economically supported.
That doesn't always mean it's easy for artists to get the support they need.
Put your money where your mouth is. Budgets are about priorities, and they talk about what our values are. And I don't see that the city really has a plan or really values the African American community or the artistic community here. So, show me the money, show us in a way that's real, that we matter and that you care about keeping the community here, and not only keeping it here, but helping it thrive.
Cheryl Davis is the head of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. She's lived in the Western Addition and has a long history of community work in the neighborhood.
You know, I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to keep more artists and people of color in San Francisco, specifically because, first and foremost, I know that this current mayor, Mayor London Breed, has a special place in her heart for the arts, has contributed and really made some commitments to the arts. I'm hopeful for District 5. I know that there are some spaces in the community that they've been looking at to actually build artist residence and live-work lofts and things.
There have been efforts over the years to revitalize a Fillmore Jazz District. Optimistic plans for a new Fillmore Heritage Center have been mired in difficulties for the currently closed complex. The annual Fillmore Jazz Festival is one success that carries the neighborhood's name and brings thousands each July. But some say it will take more than just good intentions and fond memories to infuse the neighborhood with more support for the arts.
The number one issue or challenge or solution is like how to actually invest in that. Not to talk about the importance of it, but to actually put money where it's needed. So I'm hopeful that some of the housing that's going to come online is going to be specifically for folks who have been displaced and giving them kind of right to return or first right to come back. And so we know who those people are. They're predominantly people of color. But that we also want to make it so that our artists are not being pushed out of the city, because we will lose so much of our culture if we lose artists.
A community without art is not really a community. You need that ability to express yourself in whatever form, whether it's audio through music or visual arts. And that's what creates the vitality and vibrancy of a city. And San Francisco is known for that.
Joy has always been, in my opinion, one of the strengths of the African American community. In the hundreds of years that we've been in this country and under really dire and difficult circumstances, we've maintained our joy throughout. From gospel music to giving birth to major genres of music. Blues and jazz came from our community. That comes out of experiencing pain and oppression. It makes you creative.
Those who want to hold on to the neighborhood's legacy have a vision of teaching children music through the lens of history.
Any time you know history, it's a benefit for knowing the truth about where you are, where you're going. And without that, it's kind of a mystery.
Darlene Roberts spent time in the Fillmore in her 20s, and along with Dr. David Hardiman, is the co-founder of Fillmore Jazz Ambassadors.
My big vision is to walk in a room seeing a room full of kids with instruments. My vision is seeing us unite all the elements of jazz together under one roof, so that when visitors come, they know where to go for jazz. We want to unite everything jazz here.
I see it's important also for us to do this, and Sam helps me see that. We're writing music, we're composing, we're performing, but there's a deeper kind of connection that happens when you get up on stage and you share your music. That's a part of how I grew up. That's all San Francisco, that's all Fillmore, so you hear it and you feel it when we perform or when we do our music.
And the Fillmore today is, it's survivors. It's comprised of survivors. It's people that are, figuring out how to make it still. They want to live and thrive just like everyone else in this city. So it's a far cry from what it used to be. But we're still here.
There's something the Romans call genius loci, or spirit of a place. And to me, the Fillmore has always had this creative spirit, and people still come here for entertainment. But one of my favorite things about living here is I get to say, I'm a Black artist living in the Fillmore, a place made famous by Black artists. The Fillmore lives on. On our next transmission, we look at the art and culture of the Tenderloin